All right, Economist Mike Schussler is among those who've been crunching the numbers to work out the impact of the coronavirus on the local economy and the society in general. I mean, he's been going back in history to check what event in history can teach us about the economic impact of the coronavirus. We've since re-established connection with Mike, and he joins us now via Skype for a chat. Mike, a very good evening to you. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to the Globe.
Thank you for having me, Sipa. Thank you for being here.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure, Mike. Now, perhaps before we get into it, what are your thoughts on the lockdown extension?
Well, it is certainly going to harm the economy. I'm not a virologist. I am very concerned about people and their jobs. I'm concerned about our well-being, economically speaking, and I think that's where we are at the moment. We are at a very harsh decision that had to be made. I'm not criticizing it. I think we've got to look at ways that we can ease the burden of business, allowing perhaps more businesses to operate in this time period of the extension, be it whatever, takeaways or so on, just so that we can get more people getting an income. Otherwise, it's going to be very, very difficult to come back. That is my thoughts. And the other thing is we're not even sure if this extension will be the only one. And that creates a lot of uncertainty. And the second uncertainty is they now say they expect a peak of this virus in September. If that is the case, then we have to close again maybe later. And that will certainly hurt the economy even more.
Not just the economy, but more especially those who live on a hand-to-mouth basis. And if people cannot eat, they'll see no reason of obeying the lockdown. I mean, they see no reason of locking themselves in their shacks for the whole month without getting out and sourcing the means of getting food on the table. I know, Mike, that you've been looking at the impact of COVID-19, particularly on the unemployment levels. What does this extension mean then for the employment outlook?
Well, on a month basis, a month long, I worked out it was 1.67 million people in the formal sector. That will then have a knock-on effect into the domestic workers and in the informal sector. So we're looking at about 2 million job losses. This is now an extra week. It will probably add another 100, 200,000. Nobody really knows, but I think we're now looking over 2 million job losses by the end of June. Even if the lockdown, is over in 2 weeks' time or 3 weeks from now, but it is a huge problem, and it's especially the vulnerable people. In other words, the people working in lower-end jobs in retail, hotels, restaurants, factories. Those are the places where people are really going to get hurt. The people at the bank level or working in IT, they are not as exposed. And they can do a lot of the work from their own offices or at home and so on. It's those people that live hand to mouth, as you say, that will have the problem. Ironically, I think the people that provide food in areas where people are not going to have quite as much of a problem in that part of the retail, even the informal sector there. But I think, for example, the taxi industry is struggling. I think the travel industry, whether it's a big company like an SAA or a Comair, they're all going to be in very, very dire straits. So, 2 million people out of 16 million people working is a very reasonable estimate, and it can go higher when we have the longer the lockdown lasts.
Now, another issue that you've been looking at, Mike, is how this current pandemic compares to what happened back in history with regards to a similar outbreak, the Spanish flu in 1918. So are there any lessons that you can perhaps learn from this event?
Yes, in 1918 to 1920, the world went through a very big pandemic. A lot of people, about 50 million people, some say 100 million people, lost their lives. We were only 1.5 billion people then. We're now 7.5 billion people. But the world took about 3.5 years to recover from that. I think the Great Depression, where we saw massive job losses, stock market blowout, inflation turning into deflation, that lasted about 7 years. So this is basically both events combined in a way. because we didn't have a lockdown in the Spanish flu situation. So the flu worked its way out. In South Africa, most of the cases were over a 6-week period in the end of 1918. It affected farm production the year afterwards because people were just too sick and too ill to help with the farm production. There was also a bit of a drought. But we were still very much an agricultural society. The mines took a hit. But those two sectors is where the main crux was. But it took us a while to get out of that. And the average country did it in about 3 years at that stage. So this is also a lockdown now. Maybe the disease is over quicker, but the economic impact is maybe longer, because we saw with the Great Depression, that's about 7 years. So a little bit more than double the time period that we've had with the Spanish flu. So I think that's where I'm looking at. I think the Spanish flu is very, very interesting. It did impact virtually the whole world like we have today. Many more people, however, died. And there were 2 waves. And that second wave was more deadly, and it harmed economies a lot more, because by then people were fearful. And I think this fearful factor is already here, because then they didn't have sort of modern media. It's called the Spanish flu because it didn't start in Spain, but the Spanish weren't involved in World War I, and they still had a media that printed. So they wrote up the story about this flu coming along, and it got the name the Spanish flu from there. And they were hit relatively mildly. But the later it went, whether it was South Africa, the United States, Sierra Leone, Philippines, India got hit very hard. It got worse and worse. And people didn't understand what was hitting them. And because it was over so quickly, the first round had traveled around the world within about 7 or 8 months. What we've got today, obviously, is very different, because we have much more modern things like aircraft that take people around the world in hours rather than in days and weeks. And there's a lot more traffic of people than there was then. So this thing spread quite a lot quicker. But if I look at it, the death rate of the Spanish flu was definitely a lot larger. The economic impact is probably not as big as we're going to have now with the lockdown all over the world. The supply chain disruption is huge. Then they had much smaller supply chain lengths. Now we have much more complicated supply chains. So I think it's very much a situation where we've got to look at this and understand that this is going to take years to recover economically. It's not what markets think, like a V shape. It's going to be much more like a Nike shape, where the Nike logo goes up slowly towards a few years from now. We'll be back. And we will be back, I have no doubt, but it will take time.
It is a sad reality, but very scary. And perhaps one of the biggest lessons in yesteryears, Mike, was central banks dropping interest rates. But isn't there a danger of a lower interest rate, leading to higher inflation? In short, will a temporary reprieve not come back later to bite us in massive proportions?
Well, if we all print money, and we all do it, all the countries in the world do it, just to get us out of the situation, and we do get a bit of inflation, we can take care of that later. And I think that's the big difference now. We have learned a lot from the Great Depression, and central banks are acting a lot quicker. But we have higher debt levels as well, so that is the other tricky part. But I think if central banks, particularly those that have reserve currencies, and with that I mean the USA, the euro, the yen, Swiss franc and pound, those currencies are able to print money, and if they coordinate it and they allow swap facilities for emerging markets like us and other markets, they've already allowed New Zealand, Brazil, for example, from the Fed, and Mexico to be part of the swap facility. It would help greatly, because at the end of the day, we're also buying American and European stuff here, whether it's cars or cell phones or whatever the case may be. And we don't have the ability to just print. We've seen many emerging markets try that. Zimbabwe, Venezuela, Argentina more recently even. And it always ends up with a much higher inflation rate than people can handle. And inflation is a tax on the poor. It hits poor people much harder than rich people because rich people can adjust their prices or their salaries because of demand later on or quite quickly. Poor people can't. So that's something that we've got to look at in this situation. But I think central banks are doing a lot of quantitative easing. In other words, they're printing money, they're buying government bonds. We need, however, to have a coordinated central bank response. For South Africa would be the best outcome. We've already got a bit of money from the New Development Bank. But if we could get, a loan at 0.5% a year from the Federal Reserve Bank, which they gave other countries, would help greatly. We also know that the IMF, we have money at the IMF as such. It's called SDRs. They come in, it's made up of dollars and pounds and the like. But ultimately, that comes in at about 24 Rand to one of them. So we have, at this moment in time for South Africa, 42 billion Rand there. We can maybe get away with lending 10 times that much from the IMF. So these are the things that we're going to have to look at. But I think it's going to take a coordinated response because there are now 90 countries, 90 countries that have applied to the IMF as of, I think it was Wednesday. Look, I'm only reading this on online stuff, so it's not, live. But we can expect that to go well over 100 countries applying to the IMF. And I don't know if the IMF will have all the money. So I think we need a coordinated response, perhaps organized via the G20 or the G7. And that would help a lot of other emerging markets who, like us, are in the same boat because they've also had to do lockdowns. And like us, they've already lent and borrowed a lot of money, and they just don't have the money to get themselves out of that. But the first world must remember that the third world is producing for them, and we're also their customers. Yeah. So if we lose out, they lose out. So I think a coordinated response where everybody does their bit on the monetary side and fiscal side would be great. And then I think for South Africa, we will have to...
You're quite right there, Mike. I mean, a coordinated response is very key at this particular time, more especially because this crisis is devastating to the consumer spending power. And it's prudent for the government to start, invigorating the stimulus packages from the top stimulate the economy from the bottom. But Mike, thank you so much for your time and your reflections. Much appreciated. That was Economist Mike Schussler from economist.co.za. He's been crunching the numbers for us with regards to the impact of coronavirus on the local economy.